Today we're going to talk about abuse of older people by family members and how these situations can appear in residential aged care. We know that abuse of aged care residents can be carried out not only by family members, but also by staff members and other residents. We also know that most family members do an excellent job of caring for the older people in their lives. However, abuse of older people by family members does happen in our community, and this is now recognised as a form of family violence. Those of us working in residential aged care need to be able to recognise the signs of possible abuse by a family member. Helen, what should we be looking out for?
Thanks, Lisa. There are 5 types of elder abuse, and for each of them, there are signs to look out for. First is financial abuse. This includes taking an older person's money or property, misusing a power of attorney, denying an older person access to their funds, or forcing an older person to change legal documents. This might present as an older person being worried about legal or financial matters, changes to an older person's usual access to money, an older person being asked to sign documents, particularly documents that they're not sure what they're about, and families asking the residential care service for documents or information about the older person. Another type is psychological or emotional abuse. This is behaviour that can be intimidating or pressuring, threatening, humiliating, bullying, or repeatedly criticising the older person. The older person can appear depressed or tearful, angry or withdrawn, and will often express feelings of hopelessness or being unwanted. There's also physical abuse. This includes the use of any violence or too much force. There might be injuries such as bruising or finger marks, unexplained falls in the presence of a family member. The older person may display some discomfort or withdrawal. There is also neglect. This is not caring for an older person properly, particularly an older person who might be dependent on a family member or loved one for their care. It can be demonstrated by ignoring needs or requests for clothes or personal items, medicine, or health care. Neglect can be leaving an older person alone for a long time, or the older person not having the necessities of life to lead a dignified and healthy life. Then there is sexual abuse, which can include sexual harassment, sexual assault, indecent exposure, including exposure to sexually explicit material or language, and inappropriate touching. Signs may include physical injuries, unexplained sexually transmitted diseases, and psychological symptoms including anxiety and sleep disturbance, fear of being touched, or being alone with just one other person. It's important to know that laws in Victoria that help protect people who experience family violence cover all the types of abuse I've mentioned, not just physical abuse, which is why we talk about elder abuse as a form of family violence. This means that older people who experience any of these types of elder abuse can contact the police or apply for legal orders, such as intervention orders.
Thanks, Helen. Kay, how common is elder abuse by a family member?
Elder abuse by family members is often not reported. This can be for a range of reasons, including the older person feeling shame and guilt about the behaviour of a family member. We think that between 2 and 14% of older people have experienced elder abuse by a family member. There are factors that can increase this risk. Ageism refers to attitudes in the community which can discriminate against older people. This results in some people ignoring the human rights of older people. Financial pressures on an older person's family. This can include children and grandchildren as well. An older person with a disability or dementia. And past family relationships can cause problems between family members.
Thanks, Kay. Let's look at some case studies.
Marion has been a resident in the residential aged care service of her local rural hospital for just over 12 months. She and her family are well known around the town, and Marion has been reasonably settled and socially engaged at the residential service. Last weekend, her daughters visited her with a lawyer. After they'd left, a staff member noticed that Marion was visibly upset. On reflection, the staff member thought that Marion had been withdrawn over the previous week. We now know that Marion had been asked by her daughters to make changes to her will so that her son would be left out of the will. The daughters visit Marion regularly, bringing new clothes and medications when needed. The son lives in Melbourne and visits less often.
Okay, so there are definitely some warning signs here. Marion's daughters have asked her to change her will, and that's a sign of potential financial abuse. And also the fact that Marion's upset and has been withdrawn could suggest psychological abuse as well, perhaps the way they've gone about it. Maybe she's felt bullied or intimidated by them. At this point, what is really important to consider, though, is the impact on the older person as a sign of potential abuse.
And I think it's really interesting that we in residential aged care get to know the resident very well, and we also get to interact very closely with the family, and we have a very good relationship with families. And in this case, the relationship will be with the daughters. So we could take the idea of this is a family issue and let's step back. But is that okay to do?
Well, I'm not so sure there's enough warning signs here to make me suspect that maybe she's been pressured into changing her will. And really, they need to understand, and everyone needs to understand, that it's Marion's wishes that should be in the will, not somebody else's, and that she's got a right to make those decisions even if she doesn't agree with her daughters, or the daughters don't agree with her. And if she's being made to do this against her will, it really is a breach of her rights, her human rights, because she should be making the will unencumbered by others. So in a case like this, Lisa, if a staff member feels that her wishes aren't being considered, what should a staff member do?
Yes, so in this situation, these are the actions to take. First, make a file note recording what you have observed, in this case, a change in Marion's mood and behaviour, which could be related to a visit by her daughters. Then, tell your supervisor or manager of your concerns about possible abuse. Okay, moving on, let's talk about Peter.
Peter came to a residential aged care service 2 months ago from hospital following a heart attack. Peter had previously lived alone in his own home. His nephew has medical and financial powers of attorney and has been the contact person for the residential service. Since Peter has been admitted to residential care, the nephew has not been to visit and he hasn't answered any calls from staff. Peter has been unsettled since arriving and repeatedly told staff that he has a home that he had planned to return to once he left the hospital. We now know that while recovering from his heart attack, Peter had put medical and financial power of attorney in place for his nephew. Investigation found that Peter's nephew had his uncle's home on the market.
Well, I can definitely see some warning signs of financial abuse and possibly even neglect here. It does look like Peter's nephew could be misusing the power of attorney, and that's a sign of potential financial abuse. Although as power of attorney, his nephew does have the authority to sell his house, any decisions that he's making in that role needs to absolutely reflect Peter's wishes. And in this case, we know that Peter expected to go home, not for his home to be sold. We also know that the nephew hasn't been returning calls from the facility and he hasn't been visiting Peter, and Peter's been quite agitated and unsettled since he's been at the facility. So it does sound like this could be neglect of Peter's care. So again, it's really important to consider the impact that this is having on Peter. In this case, Peter's made it clear he's in residential care against his wishes.
So Helen, there may be some questions regarding Peter's capacity to make decisions, and that may need to be assessed. But Kay, even if there was some impairment, Peter's concerns need to be taken seriously.
They do need to be taken seriously, and he may have limited capacity in some areas, but he has the capacity to decide where he wants to live. And I think we might be seeing here some examples of Peter's rights and his preferences not being considered, and I think that's absolutely vital. So if a staff member saw this, what should they do?
So in this case, we should first make a file note recording what you have observed. In this case, Peter's frequent comments about not wanting to be in residential care. Then tell your supervisor or manager of your concerns about possible abuse. Okay, next up we have Jeff and Rosie.
Jeff is in his late 60s and has middle-stage dementia. He has been in residential care for 6 months as it was becoming difficult for his wife of 40 years, Rosie, to care for him at home. Rosie takes Jeff home on weekends to see the family and brings him back on Sunday afternoons. A couple of staff members have noticed bruising on Rosie's face. Rosie has also asked staff members about Jeff's behaviour in care and whether he is ever angry or violent or inappropriate towards female staff or residents.
So Rosie's bruising could indicate physical abuse, and the fact that she's concerned about Jeff's behaviour towards staff and residents, particularly female staff and residents, might also suggest that Jeff's been psychologically abusive and even sexually abusive. What we need to think about is when a person goes into residential care, private, hidden lives become public. So we don't know whether this possible abuse has started happening because of Jeff's dementia or if it's been going on for many years. Either way, the signs of possible abuse have come to our attention, and we need to look at the impact on the individual. In this case, it's not a resident we're concerned about, but a resident's family member.
Helen, you mentioned earlier the family laws that can protect people against abuse, and Rosie may be able to use those, but often older people are reluctant to get the police and maybe even the courts involved, and maybe there would be other ways that she could seek help. It seems as if she's being abused, but what are the ways, Lisa, that staff could assist her in getting the help beyond police or the courts?
Well, Kay, aged care services have not only a duty of care to the resident, but also to family members. And it's the best interest of everyone for family and staff to work together. In this case, the residential aged care staff should be concerned about Rosie, even though she's not a resident. And they should follow the usual steps. In this situation, as with others, you should make a file note recording what you have observed. In this case, Rosie's bruising and questions about her husband's behaviour. Then tell your supervisor or manager of your concerns about possible abuse. In some cases, you might need to follow up with your supervisor to find out how your concern has been actioned. The cases we have looked at today show that abuse by family members can occur in residential aged care and that family relationships are complex. It's important that we are aware of the types of elder abuse and how to recognise the signs. If you ever suspect any kind of elder abuse, make a file note, tell your supervisor or manager, and follow up with your supervisor or manager if necessary. Our next session will discuss how to have difficult conversations with older people about suspected abuse. Thanks everyone for this discussion.